I forgot my phone on the table after a family dinner. And that small mistake was the last ordinary thing I did before my life split cleanly in two. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand who I was before that night. Because identity matters when it is about to be dismantled. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and for more than 30 years, my hands and eyes were trusted with things most people never notice until they are gone. I am an architectural conservator. I restore historic buildings the way surgeons restore both, carefully, patiently, honoring every original line and hidden weakness, and I spent my life protecting structures others were eager to replace, proving over and over that preservation is not nostalgia, but responsibility. That evening was supposed to be a celebration. Nathan insisted on it. He chose the Restaurant 10 old converted library with weighted ceilings and soft amber lighting, the kind of place that whispers prestige. And he said it was to honor my upcoming 63rd birthday and my so-called retirement discussions, while his wife Brooke sat beside him perfectly composed, dressed in muted elegance that somehow still felt calculated, the table arranged with delicate plates, wine decanted precisely, voices low and respectful, and to anyone watching it looked like a loving family honoring a matriarch. But from the moment I sat down, something felt wrong, not loud wrong, quiet wrong, like a building with a hidden crack only a trained eye can sense. My vision had been troubling me for months, subtle at first, blueprints blurred at the edges, depth unreliable, and I told myself it was fatigue age, long nights squinting over drawings. Yet that night the room seemed to tilt ever so slightly, as if even the floor could not be trusted. "Mom, you look tired," Nathan said gently, reaching across the table with concern practiced to perfection. "You should really slow down. You have nothing left to prove." And Brooke nodded, her smile soft but persistent. "You built something incredible, Eleanor, but it might be time to let go. Stress is terrible for your condition." My condition, they had started using that word recently like a diagnosis that excused every suggestion they made next. Speaking of responsibility, of protecting me, of how difficult it must be to work when your eyesight begins to fail, framing retirement as relief, legal paperwork as convenience, signing authority over as an act of love, and Nathan said he only wanted to help, that he would never change my legacy. I listened, I nodded, while inside something heavy pressed against my chest because I had built my firm from nothing, fought developers, councils, corporations, preserved schools, choruses, churches, places where memory lived in stone. And now, under polite lighting with my own family, I felt reduced to an obstacle that needed to be gently moved aside. Maybe they were right, I thought. Maybe I was becoming a liability. The last restoration proposal I reviewed had taken longer than usual. I had missed a minor measurement error and corrected it later. But the doubt lingered, and doubt is dangerous. It corrodes faster than rust, so I agreed to consider the paperwork. I said we would discuss it soon, and the relief on their faces was immediate and unmistakable, which stung more than any argument would have. When dinner ended, I stood carefully, steadying myself against the chair. Nathan offered to walk me out, but I declined because I needed air, distance from the table, and from the quiet victory glowing in their eyes. And outside the night felt hollow. The street smelled like rain on old stone, though I barely registered it. I reached into my bag to call a car, and my phone was gone. So I sighed, irritated with myself, and turned back toward the entrance. The restaurant was quieter now, chairs stacked, lights dimmed, and as I stepped inside, a strange stillness settled over me, thick and expectant. And that was when I saw the waitress looking straight at me, her face pale, her eyes wide with urgency. And before I could ask a single question, she moved toward the door and locked it behind me. And everything I thought I knew ended right there. The sound of the lock clicking into place was soft, almost polite, yet it echoed inside my chest like a gunshot. I turned instinctively and said, sharper than I intended, "Excuse me, I just need my phone. I'm leaving." But the waitress did not move. She was young, maybe mid-20s, dark hair pulled back too tightly, hands trembling despite her effort to appear calm, her name tag reading Mara, and she swallowed hard, glanced toward the dining room and back at me, whispering, "Please, you have to trust me. I wouldn't do this if it wasn't serious." And my heart began to race, because every professional instinct I had learned over decades told me this was wrong. A locked door, a stranger asking for trust, yet there was something in her eyes that stopped me from pushing past her. Fear, yes, but not for herself, for me. "I don't feel well," I said quietly. "If this is a joke, it's in very poor taste." And she replied, "It's not a joke. I saw something, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. But I need you steady. Promise me you won't faint." And the word faint felt like an insult, though even as I bristled the room swayed slightly, as if to mock my pride. I nodded once, because there was nothing else to do, and Mara led me quickly through a narrow corridor behind the bar, past shelves of glacier and linen carts, into a small staff room that smelled faintly of detergent and burnt coffee, and against one wall stood a desk with a security monitor glowing dimly. She closed the door behind us and lowered her voice even further, saying, "This camera covers your table. The one above, I wasn't supposed to look, but I did because something felt wrong." And then she tapped the keyboard and the screen flickered before settling into grainy black and white footage, and I recognized the angle instantly. It was us, my table, my dinner, the timestamp reading 23 minutes earlier. I watched myself stand up from the chair, adjust my jacket, and walk out of frame toward the restroom, and my posture looked older than I felt, slightly unsteady, vulnerable, and my throat tightened as I saw it. But then, the moment I had left the frame, everything changed. Nathan leaned back in his chair, and the warmth drained from his face like water down a sink. He scanned the room quickly, not with concern, but calculation, and Brooke shifted closer to him, angling her body to block the table from view, and my son reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and I leaned forward without realizing it as he pulled out a small vial, clear, slim, not something you'd mistake for medication. And he twisted the cap with practiced ease and tilted it over my wine glass. Just a few drops, efficient, careful, and Brooke laughed, not loudly, just enough to show pleasure. My breath caught and my fingers dug into the edge of the desk to keep myself upright as on the screen. Nathan slid the vial back into his pocket and lifted my glass slightly, swirling it as if admiring the color. He said something and Mara reached forward and turned on the audio, and Nathan's voice came through, casual and amused. "She thinks it's age. The doctors say stress, perfect cover." And Brooke snorted softly and asked, "How long until she can't see straight at all?" And he replied, "Couple more weeks. If she keeps drinking it, then she'll sign anything." I felt the room fold inward. My ears rang, my knees buckled, and I sank down onto the cold linoleum floor with my back against the cabinet, my breath coming in short, broken gasps, because this was my son, my child, the boy whose homework I checked by lamplight, whose hands I held crossing busy streets, and on the screen Nathan mimicked a tremor, exaggerating it, mocking my unsteady hands, while Brooke wiped tears of laughter from her eyes, and they were not worried about me, they were enjoying my collapse. Mara dropped to her knees beside me, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know who you were at first, but no one deserves this." And I couldn't answer. I couldn't scream. I could only stare at the screen as the truth carved itself into me, clean and irreversible, because the dinner had never been a celebration. It had been a rehearsal for my eraser. For a long moment I stayed on the floor with my back pressed against the cold metal cabinet, my breath shallow and uneven. The image on the screen burned into my mind, replaying over and over without mercy. And betrayal has weight. It presses down on your chest until every breath feels borrowed. And Mara knelt beside me, unsure whether to touch me or not, her hands hovering in the air, trembling almost as much as mine had been at the table, and she said softly, "I should call someone. An ambulance, or the police." And no came out of me sharper than I expected, and I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to slow because not yet. I needed my mind clear. Panic would only give my son exactly what he wanted. Mara hesitated, and I saw conflict flicker across her face. But she nodded and said quietly, "I think you should know something. My father works in industrial safety, chemical exposure cases. I grew up hearing about substances that don't kill you, but make you weak, make you doubt yourself." And that caught my attention. So I opened my eyes and looked at her properly for the first time, and saw that she wasn't just frightened, she was certain. And she continued, "When I saw him pour it, I recognized the way he handled it. Too confident. That's not medicine, and it's not random. It's calculated." The room stopped spinning at that word, calculated, because that word mattered. And for months my eyesight had been failing in patterns, not chaos, worse, at certain times of day, worse after meals I shared with Nathan, slight improvement when I traveled alone for work, and I had blamed stress, fatigue, age, but age does not follow schedules, poison does, and a strange calm crept in, cold and focused like the moment before a difficult restoration, when you finally identified the source of structural failure. Because once you see the crack, the fear changes shape, it becomes solvable. And I said aloud, more to myself than to her, I am not dying. And Mara looked at me startled and said, what? And I answered, I'm not losing my sight naturally. This is not decline, this is interference. And the word tasted bitter, but it grounded me. And I pushed myself up slowly, testing my balance. The weakness still there, but now understood. And understanding changes everything. And I met her eyes and said, thank you. What you did tonight may have saved my life. And her lips pressed together as she said, I just couldn't let you walk out not knowing. They were laughing. And I kept thinking, if that were my mother. And with that thought lodged like a blade in my chest, I reached into my bag, pulled out my wallet, and handed her several bills. She started to protest, but I shook my head and said, this is not payment for silence. This is gratitude. But I need one thing from you. And when she answered, anything, I told her, you saw nothing. I forgot my phone. I came back, picked it up, and left. And if anyone asks, that is the entire story. And Mara nodded without hesitation and said, I promise. I took my phone from the desk where she had placed it and walked toward the back exit, my legs heavy but my spine straight. And when the cool night air hit my face, it felt different now, sharper, real. And I did not cry on the way home, because grief would come later, and right now I needed control. At home the house was silent, too silent. Nathan and Brooke would not return until late. And I did not go to my bedroom but to my studio, the room where I kept my earliest drawings and tools, where every surface carried the weight of memory and precision. And I sat at my drafting table and stared at my hands, steady not because the poison had left my system but because fear had. And they thought they were dismantling me, when in truth they had done something far more dangerous. They had awakened me, and for the first time, since my vision began to blur, I understood with perfect clarity that my greatest threat was no longer time. It was trust. The studio was the only room in the house that never felt unfamiliar, no matter how long I stayed away from it. And even in the dim light of early morning, it welcomed me with a quiet honesty the rest of the world lacked. Drafting tables exactly where I had left them, rolled plans resting in their slots, shelves of notebooks and glass slides lining the walls, each one labeled in my own careful hand. And this room had never lied to me. So I locked the door behind me and turned on the overhead lamp, its white light cutting through the shadows and settling over the table like a surgeon preparing for an incision. Whatever my son had put into my body had come from a place of calculation, which meant it would leave traces. And at the bottom of my bag, wrapped in a napkin, was the wineglass coaster I had absent-mindedly taken from the restaurant, a faint red stain marking its edge where the glass had sweated. And I placed it gently on the table, as if it were evidence in a trial. Years ago, before I ever touched historic stone or timber, I had trained in material degradation analysis, and I knew that light, pressure, chemicals, buildings fail for reasons. So do but. And I retrieved a small, portable optic analyzer from a locked drawer, old equipment, reliable, and scraped the faint residue from the coaster into a sample slide, added a neutral solvent, and positioned it beneath the lens, my breath slowing as I adjusted the focus. The pattern appeared almost immediately, and it was not alcohol alone but a secondary compound present, synthetic, structured, deliberately engineered. And I ran the test twice, then a third time to be certain. The results did not change. A temporary optic nerve suppressant, not permanent damage, not degenerative disease, a controlled disruption of visual processing designed to mimic natural decline, enough to cause doubt, enough to erode confidence, enough to make a woman surrender her life's work willingly. And I sat back in my chair as the truth settled over me with chilling clarity. Nathan had not wanted me dead, he wanted me obedient. I closed my eyes and let the anger rise, then settle, because rage was a blunt tool and I needed something sharper. And if the compound was temporary, that meant timing mattered. Exposure had to be repeated, carefully maintained. And if exposure stopped, recovery would follow, which meant I still had leverage. I checked the clock, 6:30 in the morning, too early to act. Too early to confront, but not too early to plan. And I picked up my phone and stared at my son's name on the screen, hesitated for a moment, then pressed call, letting my voice shake when he answered, letting panic seep into every word as I whispered, Nathan, I can't see properly this morning. It's worse. Everything feels dim. I tried to read my notes and I couldn't make sense of them. And there was a pause just long enough to hear his satisfaction hiding behind concern before he said gently, Mom, this is exactly why we talked about stepping back. Stress makes it worse. and I swallowed hard, letting my silence speak before saying, I don't want to fight it anymore. I don't want to keep pretending I'm fine. And another pause followed, shorter this time, before he said, we can bring the paperwork today. No need to wait. You should rest. And I replied, yes, please, today, and ended the call before he could say anything else. The bait was set, and I spent the next hours cleansing my system as best I could with water from sealed bottles. Plain food, steam compresses over my eyes the way I had learned long ago to relieve chemical exposure, and I did not expect miracles. I needed only enough clarity to execute what came next. Nothing more, nothing heroic, just enough to move with purpose. And then I began to move through the house methodically, as if each step were part of a blueprint I had drafted long ago. I emptied my kitchen of anything Nathan or Brooke had touched during their visits, supplements, bottles of oil, even the honey jar she liked to stir into my drinks, and everything went into the trash without hesitation, without ceremony, because hesitation was a luxury I could no longer afford. In the guest room, tucked inside a drawer beneath folded scarves, I found what I had half expected: small vials, clear liquid, identical to the one I had seen on the screen, and my hand tightened around the glass until it nearly cracked, the fragile cylinder biting into my palm as the truth pressed harder. This had never been about care, it had been about control, and now that I knew the truth, the studio behind me seemed to hum with quiet approval, as if the walls themselves recognized the shift. The tools were ready. So was I. I stood in the guest room longer than necessary, the small glass vial heavy in my palm, warm from my skin, deceptively harmless in appearance, and I knew that if I had not seen the footage, if I had not trusted the instincts that years of careful work had sharpened, I might have mistaken it for medication, or dismissed it entirely, and that was the point. I placed the vial on the desk and began to search the room properly, no longer as a homeowner tidying after visitors but as an investigator cataloging a crime scene, moving slowly, deliberately, every drawer, every cabinet, every space where familiarity could hide intent. The second discovery came from my bathroom cabinet, where Nathan had brought me a box of eye supplements weeks earlier, smiling the way sons do when they believe they are being beautiful. For your vision, Mom, doctor recommended. And I remembered feeling oddly grateful at the time, remembered the softness in my chest that now felt like evidence of my own naivety. I turned the bottle in my hands and frowned, the label sitting imperfectly, one corner lifting under my fingernail far too easily, and I peeled it back to find beneath the cheerful branding another mark printed directly onto the original container. Minimalist, stark, a symbol I recognized immediately. It belonged to Meridian Developments, and my stomach dropped because Meridian was not a pharmaceutical company. It was a ruthless real estate conglomerate, known for acquiring protected properties, draining them of legal status, and leveling them for profit. And I had blocked 3 of their major projects over the years, invoking preservation clauses and historical designations they despised me for, so this was not coincidence. I continued searching, my pulse steady but cold, and in a storage drawer behind spare linens, I found a small cardboard box. And inside were more vials, identical in size and shape, each one marked with tiny etched codes. And this was not opportunistic poisoning, it was supply, it was planning. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the weight of realization pressing into my spine, understanding with terrible clarity that Nathan had not acted alone. He had been enabled, supported, equipped, that Meridian did not just want my company. They wanted me gone, because my firm had been the last barrier between them and a string of historically protected sites: churches, schools, civic halls, buildings that could not be demolished as long as I held authority, and if I stepped aside, those protections would crumble within weeks. And they were using my son as leverage, or worse. I returned to the studio and laid everything out neatly on the table: the vial, the altered supplement bottle, photographs taken with my phone because evidence demanded order, and my mind replayed the dinner, Nathan's impatience, Brooke's smiles, their eagerness to accelerate the signing, and it all aligned now. They weren't waiting for my decline, they were engineering it. The phone on the counter buzzed and Nathan's name flashed on the screen, and I let it ring once, twice, then answered, and he said, "Mom," his voice lighter than it should have been. "Brooke and I will be there around 2. Is that okay?" And I replied, allowing my voice to soften, "Of course, I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere." And when the call ended, I allowed myself one long breath, because the betrayal was no longer personal alone. It was ideological, ethical, They were not just dismantling me, they were erasing decades of protection, of memory, of care, and they believed I was too weak to stop them. I began preparing the house for their arrival not as a place of surrender but as a stage, practicing the tremor in my hands until it looked convincing, letting my shoulders slump, placing papers in disarray where they would expect confusion, every movement deliberate, because they wanted a frail woman and I would give them one, and while they watched her fall they would never notice the ground shifting beneath their feet. The sound of tires crunching against the gravel driveway reached me before the doorbell rang, and I was already seated in the living room, wrapped in an old wool shawl, my posture slightly bent, my gaze unfocused. Having chosen this room carefully because it held just enough light to exaggerate weakness, just enough shadow to hide clarity, and when Nathan and Brooke entered they did so with the confidence of people who believed the outcome was inevitable. Nathan carrying a leather folder pressed firmly against his side, Brooke following with a bakery box tied in a neat ribbon, her expression composed and almost celebratory, and Nathan said loudly, as if volume alone might compensate for empathy, "Mom, how are you feeling?" And I blinked twice before answering, letting the pause stretch. "Oh, Nathan, you're here already. I must have lost track of time." And Brooke stepped closer and set the box on the table, saying, "We brought you something sweet. You should keep your energy up." And I leaned forward slightly, squinting at the box as though trying to identify it by shape alone, and asked softly, "Is that the vanilla cake I like?" "I can't tell anymore. Everything smells wrong lately," I said softly, letting the words drift into the room like something fragile, and they exchanged a glance quick, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. Nathan cleared his throat and answered too smoothly, "That's normal. The doctor said distortions happen when the nerves are stressed. It doesn't mean anything serious." And I nodded, clinging to the words like a frightened child clings to reassurance, whispering, "If you say so, I trust you." And that sentence did something to him. I watched his shoulders relax, watched the tension loosen at the base of his neck, because trust was the currency he had been waiting to collect. He opened the folder and placed it carefully on the table between us, and said, "We just want to get this over with so you can rest. You don't need to read everything again. It's all exactly what we discussed." And my hand trembled as I reached for the pen, letting it wobble dramatically between my fingers as I murmured, "Oh dear, I'm so clumsy today." And Brooke leaned in, her voice soft and syrupy, "It's okay, just take your time." And I lowered the pen toward the page, then gasped softly as if startled by my own movement, my elbow striking the glass water pitcher sitting beside the paper so that it tipped and water spilled across the documents in a sudden, clear flood, ink bleeding instantly, signatures blurring, official seals warping and dissolving before our eyes. "Oh no," I cried, standing abruptly and knocking my chair back with a sharp scrape against the floor. "I ruined it. I ruin everything these days." And Nathan's face flushed red before he caught himself, anger flaring too bright to hide for one brief second before it vanished behind a tight smile as he said, "It's fine. We can print another copy." And I shook my head, wringing my hands, my voice quivering. "The notary is probably closed now. I'm so sorry. I wanted to do this right." And Brooke inhaled sharply, then smiled as though smoothing over a wrinkle. "Maybe it's for the best. You shouldn't be rushed." And I looked up at them with watery, earnest eyes and asked, "The Preservation Council meets in 2 days, doesn't it? That big session you mentioned where everyone will be there?" And Nathan hesitated just long enough for me to see the calculation flicker across his face before I continued, "I could sign it there, in front of everyone. That way, no one can say you pressured me. Everyone will see I gave you everything willingly." And silence settled between us, thick and measuring, until Nathan nodded slowly and said, "Yes, that makes sense. Public is safer." And relief flickered across Brooke's face because they believed the delay worked in their favor. Nathan stepped outside to take a call, saying he needed air, and Brooke remained seated, scrolling on her phone, her attention drifting the moment I looked away. And I rose slowly and shuffled toward the hallway, as if heading upstairs, but instead I stopped just short of the landing, and turned quietly toward the window overlooking the garden where Nathan's voice carried clearly from the patio, smug and unguarded. "She's worse than we thought. Could barely hold the pen. She signed at the council meeting. No problem." And a distorted voice answered through the speaker, "Good. Once it's done, proceed immediately." And Nathan laughed, low and satisfied. "We won't waste time. The permits will move fast. By the time she realizes anything, it'll all be gone." And I stepped back from the window, my heart steady and cold. understanding that they thought the performance was over when in truth it was only just beginning. I did not sleep that night but sat at the small desk in my bedroom with the lights off and the house silent around me, replaying Nathan's words until they lost all emotion and became pure information permits. Immediately gone because he was not planning a transition. He was planning an eraser. Just before dawn, I made the call I had been avoiding, and Daniel answered on the second ring. Eleanor, surprise in his voice. It's early, and I said, I know, I need you to trust me. And I need you now. And there was a pause before he replied simply, I'm on my way, because Daniel Mercer had been my partner long before Nathan ever showed interest in my work, a structural historian meticulous and stubborn who understood one thing better than anyone else: documents outlive people, and if you protect the paper, you protect the truth. An hour later we were driving north away from the city toward a stretch of land most maps no longer bothered to label, fog thick around us and wrapping the road in quiet anonymity. And I did not explain much, only that my son had betrayed me, and that my life's work was at risk. And Daniel did not ask questions because he never did when something mattered this much. We stopped in front of a neglected municipal archive building slated for closure years ago, its sign faded and its parking lot empty so that to anyone else it looked abandoned, and I unlocked the side door with a key I had carried on my ring for 20 years and stepped inside where the air smelled of dust and aging paper, and we descended to levels underground, past rows of inactive shelves and sealed cabinets, until at the very back behind a false wall I entered a code and pressed my palm against a cold metal plate and the wall slid open. Daniel exhaled slowly and asked, Eleanor, what is this? And I answered, this is the reason Sterling survived every hostile takeover attempt for 3 decades, and the reason Nathan will fail. And inside was a vault, not money, not jewels, but deeds, original restoration charters, preservation covenants, addendums signed in ink that still carried legal force. Every building my firm had protected represented there, with clauses embedded so deeply that no public transfer of authority could dissolve them. I handed Daniel a folder and said quietly, Contingency authority. If I am declared incapacitated or coerced, all rights revert to the Preservation Trust, which I control alone. And he flipped through the pages, his eyes widening as he looked up at me and said, You never told the board about this. And I answered, I never told anyone, not even Nathan. And Daniel closed the folder carefully, almost reverently, and said, They can't touch the sites. And I replied, No. And if they try, their attempt becomes criminal interference with protected heritage. Then I placed the vial and the altered supplement bottle on the table between us and added, This makes it conspiracy. And Daniel looked up at me with something like pride in his eyes and said, They think you're fragile. And I allowed myself a thin smile and answered, They think age made me weak. In truth, it taught me where to hide the foundations, and by the time the sun rose we had copies secured in 3 locations, legal counsel alerted, and contingency notices prepared so that when Nathan arrived at the council meeting the next day, confident and impatient, he would walk into a room where every exit had already been sealed. Though he did not know it yet, the council chamber was already full when I arrived. Long wooden tables stretching across the room, microphones neatly aligned, nameplates polished to a dull shine, and people who had known me for decades nodded politely as I passed, their expressions carrying that careful mixture of respect and concern that travels quickly. When word spreads that Eleanor Whitfield was stepping down, or so they believed, Nathan sat near the front with Brooke beside him, both dressed for victory, and he stood when he saw me, offering his arm with exaggerated care, but I ignored it and walked on my own. My vision, clear, not perfect, but honest, grounded. In a fan, when my name was called, I rose slowly, allowing the room to settle into silence, because this was the moment they had prepared for, the public surrender, the signature that would unlock everything. And Nathan slid the folder toward me, the new documents pristine, the pen placed carefully on top as he said softly, For everyone to hear, take your time, Mom. And I looked at the paper, then looked up and said calmly, Before I sign anything, there is something I need to share with this council. And Nathan stiffened. Brooke's smile faltered, and I nodded to the clerk at the side of the room and said, Please play the footage. And the screen behind the council lit up, grainy black and white images filling the chamber, my table at the restaurant, me standing up and leaving, then my son reaching into his jacket, the vial, the pour, the laughter, and a murmur rippled through the room like a sudden wind as I said, Turn on the sound. And Nathan's voice echoed through the chamber, clear, smug, unmistakable. She thinks it's age. And Brooke's hand flew to her mouth while I continued before anyone could speak. For months, my declining vision was not a medical mystery. It was chemically induced, designed to mimic age-related deterioration, temporary, reversible, and administered without my knowledge or consent, and I placed the vial on the table in front of me, then the altered supplement bottle, then a folder of lab analyses and documentation, and said, "This substance was supplied by an external developer with a vested interest in dismantling historic protections I personally enforced." And gasps and whispers rose as chairs shifted sharply, Nathan standing abruptly and declaring, "This is absurd. She's confused. She's been unwell." And I met his eyes and said evenly, "I am unwell from betrayal," before turning back to the council and continuing. "In anticipation of coercion decades ago, I placed all protected site authority into a private preservation trust. Any attempt to transfer or liquidate assets under duress activates immediate reversion and criminal review." And I nodded to Daniel, seated at the far end of the chamber, who stood holding the documentation high as I added, "This meeting is now evidence," and security moved quickly. Phones confiscated, officials whispering urgently into radios while Nathan's confidence collapsed in real time, his voice cracking as he tried to speak again though no one was listening. Brooke staring at me with wide eyes, finally understanding the scale of what she had gambled, and by the time the council recessed, authorities were already waiting. Nathan not looking back as he was escorted out, and I did not reach for him because some losses do not deserve mourning. Weeks later, my firm no longer existed in its old form, but became a non-profit trust legally sealed against private exploitation, every protected building remaining protected permanently, and I returned to my studio not to rebuild what was broken but to continue what had never truly been taken. And I shared this story not for pity but for clarity, because betrayal often wears the mask of concern, because age is too often mistaken for weakness, and because the most dangerous lie we are taught is that our time is over simply because others are eager to replace us. I did not survive by becoming harder. I survived by remembering who I was before anyone tried to erase me. So never surrender your voice to those who benefit from your silence. Wisdom does not fade with age, and those who rush to claim your legacy often forget one thing: